Why did 4 people show up claiming to be my biological parent? The knock on my apartment door came at 7:23 a.m. on a Tuesday, exactly 6 days after the Riverside County Herald ran that damn article about my inheritance. I was still in my pajamas, clutching a mug of instant coffee, when I opened the door to find a woman with badly dyed blonde hair and crocodile tears streaming down her cheeks. "Sarah, my baby girl," she sobbed, reaching toward me with paint-stained fingernails. "I've been searching for you for 22 years. I stood there, frozen, as this complete stranger claimed to be my birth mother. Linda Kowalski, she said her name was. She had documents, photocopied hospital records that looked like they'd been run through a printer at a gas station, and a manila envelope she claimed contained DNA test results proving I was her daughter. The adoption agency told me you died," she wailed, pulling out tissues from a purse that reeked of cigarettes. "But I never gave up hope. I knew in my heart you were alive. Here's the thing about growing up in foster care, you develop a sixth sense for bullshit. And Linda Kowalski was radiating it like a broken microwave. The hospital records had my birth date wrong by 3 months. The DNA test was from some sketchy online company I'd never heard of. But the real kicker? She kept calling me Sarah, pronouncing it like S-A-I-R-A, when anyone who actually knew me understood it was S-A-H-R-A. I didn't slam the door in her face like I should have. Instead, I invited her in for coffee and listened to her elaborate sob story about being a teenage mother forced to give me up by her abusive boyfriend. How she'd worked 3 jobs just to afford the private investigator who finally tracked me down. How she'd dreamed of this reunion every single night for over 2 decades. It was Oscar-worthy, really. Linda was just the beginning. By Friday, I'd had visits from Robert Martinez, claiming to be my birth father, Janet Williams, another birth mother, and most audaciously, Thomas Reed, a well-dressed man in his 50s who insisted he was my biological grandfather and that his late daughter, my supposed mother, had left behind a diary expressing her deepest regrets about the adoption. 4 different people. 4 elaborate stories. 4 sets of fake documents and fraudulent DNA tests. All arriving within 1 week of the newspaper announcing that Sarah Chen, 22, formerly of the county foster system, had inherited $2.3 million from her adoptive grandmother Helen Chen's estate. I'd been Helen's only family after her own children died in a car accident 15 years ago. She took me in when I was 17, gave me her name, put me through college, and left me everything when she passed last month. The inheritance wasn't just money, it was the first time in my life someone had chosen me, really chosen me, even if I only got to be her granddaughter for 5 years. Now these vultures were circling, thinking they could exploit the one wound that never healed, the fact that my biological parents abandoned me at 3 weeks old in a hospital bathroom and never looked back. As I watched Thomas Reed climb into his BMW, apparently biological grandfathers drive luxury cars these days, I made a decision. I wasn't going to just send these people away. I was going to destroy them. I pulled out my laptop and started researching private investigators in the county. If these fraudsters wanted to play games with my pain, I'd give them a game they'd never forget. The private investigator I hired was a woman named Detective Angela Reyes, recently retired from the Riverside PD after 25 years on the force. Her office smelled like stale coffee and determination, and when I showed her the collection of fraudulent documents my 4 biological relatives had presented, she actually laughed. "Honey, I've seen better forgeries at a middle school talent show," she said, holding up Linda's hospital records to the light. "Look at this, they used Comic Sans font for what's supposed to be a 2001 medical document. Comic Sans wasn't even standard on most hospital computers back then." Detective Reyes quoted me $1,800 for a full background investigation on all 4 claimants, plus evidence gathering that would hold up in court if I decided to press charges for fraud. It felt like the best money I'd ever spent. Within 48 hours, she called me back with preliminary findings that made my blood boil. "Your friend Linda Kowalski has quite the entrepreneurial spirit," Detective Reyes said over the phone. "She's currently running 3 different inheritance scams across Southern California. Last month, she claimed to be the long-lost sister of a lottery winner in Orange County. Got away with $15,000 before they caught on. But Linda was apparently small-time compared to Thomas Reed, my supposed biological grandfather. Reed wasn't even his real name, he was actually Thomas Petrov, a con artist with a rap sheet dating back to 1997. Insurance fraud, identity theft, and at least 6 documented cases of family inheritance scams. The BMW? Stolen from a dealership in San Diego 3 weeks ago. Here's where it gets interesting," Detective Reyes continued. "These 4 aren't working together, but they're all connected to the same source. Someone's been selling your information, birth date, hospital records, foster care history, even details about your adoptive grandmother. This wasn't random, Sarah. Someone who had access to your private records is feeding these scammers everything they need to make their stories believable." My stomach dropped. "What do you mean, someone with access?" "I mean someone from the county adoption services, the foster care system, maybe even Helen Chen's legal team. The information these people have about you is too detailed, too accurate in some places. They know things that weren't in that newspaper article." I hung up the phone and stared at the pile of fake documents spread across my kitchen table. Someone I trusted, someone who was supposed to protect children like me, was selling our pain to the highest bidder. That evening, Janet Williams, birth mother number 2, showed up at my door again, this time with what she claimed were baby photos of me. The photos were clearly pulled from some random family's collection, but Janet had committed fully to her performance, complete with a new backstory about keeping vigil at my hospital bassinet before heartbreaking circumstances forced her to surrender me. I invited her in and made tea, watching her fumble through details that contradicted everything she'd told me during her first visit. She couldn't remember which hospital she claimed to have given birth at, and when I asked about the birthmark on my shoulder blade, she confidently described a strawberry mark on my left arm, which didn't exist. As Janet sat in Helen's old rocking chair, spinning lies about sleepless nights spent wondering about her precious baby girl, I realized something that chilled me more than her obvious fraud. I was starting to enjoy this. The planning, the deception, the slow building trap I was constructing around these people. Maybe that made me just as twisted as they were. But I didn't care anymore. The breakthrough came on a Wednesday morning at 6:47 a.m., when Detective Reyes called me with news that made my hands shake. "I found your leak," she said without preamble. "Margaret Hendricks, senior caseworker at County Family Services. She's been selling confidential files for 8 months. Your information went for $500 to a broker who then distributed it to at least a dozen different scam artists across 3 states. Margaret Hendricks. I knew that name. She'd been my caseworker from ages 14 to 18, the woman who'd sat across from me in sterile conference rooms and promised that my files were confidential, that my privacy was protected. She'd been there when Helen first expressed interest in fostering me, handling all the paperwork with what I thought was genuine care. The FBI is building a case against her, Detective Reyes continued. But here's the kicker, she's also been targeting other inheritance cases. That tech millionaire who died in Malibu last year. His adopted son got hit by 7 different fraudulent family claims. All traced back to information Hendricks sold. I stared at the wall where Helen had hung a photo of us from my high school graduation. In it, I was wearing the first dress I'd ever owned that fit properly, and Helen's arm was wrapped around my shoulders like she was afraid I might disappear. The woman who'd sold my information to scammers had been standing right behind the photographer that day, smiling and congratulating us. That afternoon, Robert Martinez showed up for his 3rd visit, this time bringing what he claimed was my biological mother's jewelry box. Inside were costume pieces that probably cost less than $20 total, but Robert presented them like precious heirlooms while weaving an increasingly elaborate story about my supposed mother's tragic death in a car accident. Maria always said she'd give these to her daughter someday, he said, his voice thick with manufactured emotion. She made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd find you and make sure you knew how much she loved you. The jewelry box was still warm. He'd literally just bought it, probably from a thrift store on his way over. But Robert had gotten sloppy in other ways too. During his first visit, he'd claimed to be my birth father. Today he was calling himself my mother's boyfriend who'd raised me as his own for the first few weeks of my life. When I gently pointed out the contradiction, he didn't even blink. I was so nervous during our first meeting, he said smoothly. I misspoke. The emotions, you understand. I've been dreaming of this reunion for so long. I nodded sympathetically while mentally adding perjury to the growing list of charges Detective Reyes was documenting. Each of my visitors was digging their graves deeper with every lie, every forged document, every manipulative tear. But something else was happening that I hadn't anticipated. The more I played along with their schemes, the more I found myself studying their techniques. How Linda used physical touch to create false intimacy. How Thomas leveraged his expensive clothes and car to project credibility. How Janet exploited every adoptee's desperate hunger for maternal connection. I was learning from them, and that realization should have disgusted me. Instead, it felt like power. That evening, I sat in Helen's study and opened a new document on my laptop. Operation Family Reunion, I titled it. If these people wanted to manipulate me, I'd give them the performance of their lives. I'd play the vulnerable, desperate adoptee so convincingly that they'd incriminate themselves beyond any shadow of doubt. But first, I needed to deal with Margaret Hendricks. I picked up my phone and dialed County Family Services. When the receptionist answered, I asked to speak with Margaret directly. This is Sarah Chan, I said when she came on the line. I think we need to meet. The silence on the other end of the phone stretched for exactly 11 seconds, I counted. When Margaret Hendricks finally spoke, her voice had that careful, professional tone I remembered from all those case review meetings. Sarah, what a surprise. How are you adjusting to everything? I heard about Helen's passing, and of course, the inheritance. You must be overwhelmed. Overwhelmed. That was one way to put it. Actually, that's why I'm calling, I said, keeping my voice steady. I've had some unexpected visitors recently. People claiming to be my biological family. They seem to know things about my case history that weren't in the newspaper article. Another pause. Shorter this time, but I caught the slight intake of breath. Well, that's concerning, Margaret said. Unfortunately, sometimes when these inheritance stories go public, it attracts all sorts of opportunists. I'd be happy to review your file security protocols if you'd like to come in next week. I was thinking more like today, I interrupted. This afternoon, actually. I have some documents I'd like you to look at. See if you can tell me how these people might have gotten such detailed information. I heard papers shuffling in the background. Oh, Sarah, I wish I could, but I'm absolutely swamped today. Budget meetings, you know how it is. How about Friday? Detective Reyes had warned me that Hendricks would try to buy time if I contacted her directly. People running scams always needed time to cover their tracks, to coordinate with their partners, to prepare their defenses. Margaret, I said, letting a tremor creep into my voice, I'm really scared. One of these people knew about the scar on my arm from when I fell off my bike at the Patterson house. They knew I was allergic to penicillin. They even knew about the time I ran away from the Morrison placement and spent the night in that abandoned grocery store on 5th Street. How could strangers know these things? The Morrison placement had been classified information. Only 3 people had access to those particular case notes, my assigned therapist, the placement coordinator, and Margaret herself. The therapist had died 2 years ago, and the coordinator had transferred to Sacramento in 2019. Those are definitely concerning details, Margaret said, and now I could hear the strain in her voice. Look, maybe I can move some things around. Could you come in around 4 this afternoon? Perfect. Detective Reyes had said she'd have the surveillance equipment set up in the Family Services building by 3:30. Every word of our conversation would be recorded. Thank you so much, I said, pouring relief into my voice. I'll bring copies of everything they've shown me. Maybe you can help me figure out who to report this to. After I hung up, I spent 20 minutes staring at Helen's photo on the desk. She'd been so proud when I'd aged out of the system successfully, when I'd started college, when I'd found some stability. What would she think of what I was becoming? This calculating person who could manipulate conversations and set traps? But then I thought about Linda Kowalski's paint-stained fingers reaching for me, claiming maternal love she'd never felt. About Thomas Petrov and his stolen BMW, spinning stories about a dead daughter who'd never existed. About Margaret Hendricks selling the most vulnerable details of my childhood to fund their elaborate lies. Helen would want me to fight back. She'd want me to protect other kids from this same violation. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Sarah, this is Linda. Can we meet for coffee tomorrow? I have more photos I'd like to share with you. Also, I've been thinking about what you said about wanting to know about your medical history. I remember so much more now. Love, Mom. Mom. She'd actually signed it Mom. I screenshotted the message and forwarded it to Detective Reyes with a note, evidence file number 4. The delusion is escalating. But even as I typed those clinical words, something twisted in my chest. For just a split second, reading that word Mom had sparked the same desperate hope I'd carried through 18 different foster placements. The same pathetic fantasy that someday, someone would claim me and mean it. That reaction disgusted me more than Linda's lies ever could. I replied to her text, "Coffee sounds perfect. I can't wait to learn more about our family." Then I opened my laptop and added her message to the growing evidence file I was compiling. Tomorrow's coffee meeting would be recorded, documented, and added to the criminal case Detective Reyes was building. But tonight, I had Margaret Hendricks to deal with. The County Family Services building looked exactly the same as it had 4 years ago when I'd aged out of the system: beige walls, fluorescent lighting that made everyone look sick, and that particular smell of industrial disinfectant mixed with desperation. I sat in the lobby at 3:55 p.m., watching Margaret Hendricks through the glass partition of her office as she shuffled papers with obvious anxiety. Detective Reyes had positioned herself at a desk in the adjacent office, posing as a temporary data entry clerk. The recording equipment was hidden in the pen clipped to my jacket pocket, and my phone was set to livestream audio directly to the detective's earpiece. Everything Margaret said would be documented. When she finally called me in, Margaret looked older than I remembered. Her auburn hair had gone mostly gray, and there were deep lines around her eyes that hadn't been there during my senior year of high school. She hugged me, something she'd never done during our professional relationship, and her hands trembled slightly when she pulled away. "Sarah, you look wonderful," she said, gesturing to the same uncomfortable plastic chair I'd sat in dozens of times before. "College suits you. Helen would be so proud." The mention of Helen's name in this context made my stomach turn. Margaret had attended the funeral, had squeezed my hand during the service, and told me what a special woman Helen was. All while secretly profiting off my private information. "That's actually why I'm here," I said, pulling out the manila folder containing all 4 fraudsters' fake documents. "These people keep mentioning Helen, talking about how they heard about my loss and want to help me through this difficult time. But they know things, Margaret. Personal things that aren't in any public records." I spread Linda's hospital papers across Margaret's desk, followed by Thomas's forged birth certificate claiming to show my mother's name as Rebecca Reed, Janet's fabricated DNA results, and Robert's collection of fake family photographs. Margaret picked up each document, and I watched her face carefully. She was good. 26 years of social work had taught her to control her expressions, but when she saw Thomas's paperwork, her left eye twitched. Just for a second, but I caught it. "These are obviously fraudulent," she said after examining everything. "The formatting is all wrong, and some of these agencies don't even exist anymore." "Have you contacted the police?" "Not yet," I lied. "I wanted to talk to you first. See if you could tell me how they might have gotten access to my real information. Because here's the thing, Margaret, they're not just making things up randomly. Linda knew about my appendectomy when I was 12. Thomas mentioned the time I got suspended from Jefferson High for fighting with Katie Morrison, which happened off school grounds and should only be in my case file. Janet even knew about the Christmas when Mrs. Patterson bought me that art set and I painted watercolors for 3 straight weeks. Each detail I mentioned was a test. These weren't things the scammers actually knew. I was making them up to see how Margaret would react. But they were all events that would theoretically be documented in my case history, the kind of personal information that caseworkers noted during home visits and psychological evaluations. Margaret's face had gone pale. "Sarah, those are very specific details. Are you certain these people mentioned those exact incidents?" "Positive," I said, leaning forward. "Which is why I need to know, who else has access to my file? How many people could have seen these records over the years?" She stood up abruptly and walked to the window, her back to me. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There's something I need to tell you. Something I should have reported weeks ago." Margaret turned around, tears in her eyes that looked more genuine than anything Linda Kowalski had ever produced. "I've been getting calls. People asking questions about former foster children who've come into money recently. Offering to pay for information." My heart started racing. She was going to confess. Detective Reyes was getting every word. "What kind of people?" I asked carefully. "They said they were genealogy researchers, helping families reunite. But the questions they asked." Margaret shook her head. "They wanted medical records, psychological evaluations, placement histories. Details that had nothing to do with genealogy." I waited, letting the silence stretch between us. "I never gave them anything," Margaret said quickly. "But Sarah, I think someone else might have. Someone with access to the central database." Margaret was lying, and we both knew it. But her performance was fascinating. She'd shifted from denial to misdirection to playing the role of concerned whistleblower, all in the span of 5 minutes. I almost had to admire the technique. "Someone with central database access," I repeated slowly. "Like who?" "Well, there are maybe 12 people in the county who have that level of clearance," she said, returning to her desk and pulling out a legal pad. "IT administrators, senior supervisors, the department director. I could make you a list." She started writing names, her handwriting shaky but deliberate. I watched her pen move across the paper and realized she was buying time, probably trying to figure out which of her colleagues she could sacrifice to save herself. "Margaret," I said gently, "can I ask you something personal?" She looked up, wariness flickering across her features. "Of course. How's Danny doing?" Her pen stopped moving. Danny was Margaret's youngest son, who'd been struggling with addiction issues for years. I'd overheard her on the phone about his rehab costs during one of my case meetings back in 2019. It had been none of my business then, but Detective Reyes had done her homework. Danny Hendricks had been in and out of 3 different treatment facilities in the past 18 months. Each stay cost upward of $30,000. He's getting better," she said carefully. "Why do you ask?" "Just wondering. I remember you mentioning he was having some challenges. Addiction is expensive to treat, isn't it? Even with good insurance." The color drained from Margaret's face completely. She set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap, and for a moment she looked every one of her 54 years. "What are you really asking me, Sarah?" This was it. The moment where I could push her into a full confession, get everything Detective Reyes needed to build an airtight case. But looking at Margaret's defeated expression, I felt something unexpected, pity. She wasn't a career criminal like Thomas Petrov. She was a tired social worker who'd made a terrible decision to help her struggling child. That didn't excuse what she'd done to me, to other vulnerable kids. But it made her human in a way the other fraudsters weren't. I'm asking if you've been selling case files to pay for Danny's treatment, I said quietly. Margaret's shoulders sagged. For 30 seconds, the only sound in the room was the hum of fluorescent lights overhead. It started small, she finally said. Last October, someone called asking about archived records for a genealogy company. They offered $200 for basic information, just names and placement dates. Nothing sensitive. But it escalated. Danny relapsed in December. The good facilities, the ones that actually work, they don't take insurance. And I'd already borrowed against my pension, maxed out every credit card. Her voice cracked. When they called back offering $500 per complete file, I told myself it was just information that would help families reconnect. I leaned back in my chair, processing her confession. Detective Reyes was getting all of this, but I found myself wanting to understand more than just the mechanics of the betrayal. How many files, Margaret? 43 over 8 months, she whispered. All former foster children who'd come into significant money through adoption, inheritance, or marriage. Your file went out in January, right after the probate court processed Helen's will. 43 kids. 43 people who'd already survived the trauma of abandonment and foster care, now being targeted by scammers who knew their most private vulnerabilities. The people who contacted you, I said, did they give you names? Margaret reached into her desk drawer and pulled out a small notebook. Her hands shook as she flipped through pages covered in dates, amounts, and contact information. David Chen, no relation to you, obviously. He said he ran a family reunification service. But there was also a woman named Patricia Voss, and someone who only gave me a phone number. She showed me the notebook. I kept records of everything. I guess part of me knew this day would come. Looking at those meticulous records of her own crimes, I realized Margaret wanted to be caught. The guilt had been eating at her for months. My phone buzzed with a text from Detective Reyes. FBI is moving on the buyers today. Keep her talking about the contact methods. The trap was closing around everyone involved in this scheme, and Margaret Hendricks was about to become the key witness in a federal case. But first, I had 4 more fraudsters to deal with. 3 hours after Margaret Hendricks signed her confession statement at the FBI field office, I was sitting in a Starbucks on Maple Street watching Linda Kowalski practice her maternal reunion performance in the bathroom mirror. She'd arrived 20 minutes early, probably to scope out the location and rehearse her story, and had no idea I could see her through the gap in the bathroom door. She was mouthing words to herself, adjusting her expression from grief-stricken mother to hopeful reunion, testing different levels of tears. At one point, she pulled out a small bottle of eye drops and applied them liberally before dabbing at her cheeks with tissues. My phone vibrated with an update from Detective Reyes. Margaret's cooperation netted us 12 arrests across 4 states. David Chen was running the whole operation from a warehouse in Phoenix. Your 4 are the last targets we need to close this case. When Linda finally emerged from the bathroom, her eyes were perfectly red-rimmed and her lower lip had that slight tremble she'd perfected during our previous meetings. She spotted me immediately and rushed over with her arms outstretched. My sweet girl, she gushed, enveloping me in a hug that reeked of cigarettes and desperation. I brought those photos I mentioned. And I have so much more to share with you about your early weeks with me. I let her hold me for exactly 5 seconds, long enough for the recording device to capture her performance, short enough to maintain my sanity. When she pulled away, her eyes were glistening with fresh artificial tears. I also brought this, she said, reaching into her oversized purse and withdrawing a small, tarnished silver locket. This was the only thing I had left from your grandmother, my mother. I've been saving it for you all these years. The locket was clearly a recent purchase from some vintage shop, complete with a price sticker that she'd tried unsuccessfully to peel off. But what made my blood run cold was the photo inside, a black and white picture of a woman who looked nothing like me, holding a baby that could have been anyone. That's you at 6 weeks old, Linda said with practiced conviction. And that's my mother, Eleanor. You have her eyes. I stared at the photo, and for a split second, I felt that familiar ache, the desperate want to believe, to finally have answers about where I came from. Even knowing this was all fabricated, part of me wished it could be real. Tell me about her, I said, testing how far Linda would take this new invention. About Eleanor. Linda's face lit up like she'd been waiting for this question. Oh, she was wonderful. A seamstress who immigrated from Poland in 1952. She raised 6 children on her own after your grandfather died in a factory accident. The story flowed smoothly, probably recycled from some other scam or borrowed from a movie she'd watched. What was her maiden name? I asked innocently. Kowalski, Linda said without missing a beat. Eleanor Kowalski. The family name has been passed down for generations. Kowalski was Linda's married name. I'd seen it on the background check Detective Reyes had run. Her maiden name was actually Martinez, and she'd been married 3 times. But watching her weave this elaborate fiction about Polish heritage and family traditions, I had to admit she was committed to the performance. I've been thinking, I said, stirring my untouched latte. About what you said regarding wanting to make up for lost time. I was wondering if you'd be interested in meeting the rest of my family. Linda's eyebrows shot up. The rest of your family? Well, it's interesting, I continued, watching her face carefully. Since we reconnected, 3 other people have reached out claiming to be my biological relatives too. Maybe you know them? The color drained from Linda's face so fast I thought she might actually faint. She gripped her coffee cup with both hands, knuckles going white, and for the first time since I'd met her, the practiced performance cracked completely. Other people? She stammered, abandoning the maternal warmth she'd been projecting. What do you mean, other relatives? I pulled out my phone and scrolled to the photos I'd taken of each fraudster's documents, making sure she could see Thomas Petrov's forged birth certificate claiming I was his granddaughter. Thomas Reed says he's my biological grandfather. He has paperwork showing my mother was his daughter Rebecca, who died tragically young. I swiped to the next photo. And Janet Williams insists she's my birth mother too. She has DNA results and everything. Linda's breathing had become shallow and rapid. She kept glancing toward the coffee shop exit like a trapped animal looking for escape routes. There's also Robert Martinez, I continued conversationally. He claims to be my birth father, though his story keeps changing. Yesterday he said he was my mother's boyfriend who helped raise me for the first few weeks. That's impossible, Linda whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient cafe noise. They're lying. They're all lying. I'm your real mother, Sarah. I have proof. But here's what's so interesting, I said, leaning forward slightly. You all know the same specific details about my childhood. Details that weren't in the newspaper article. Like how Robert mentioned my appendectomy scar, and Janet knew about my penicillin allergy, and Thomas even referenced my art phase when I was 14. Linda's left eye had developed a noticeable twitch. Those must be lucky guesses. Or maybe they researched you somehow. Maybe, I agreed. Or maybe you all got your information from the same source. The silence stretched between us for nearly a minute. Linda stared into her untouched cappuccino while I watched her internal calculation process play out across her features. She was weighing her options, double down on the lie, abandon the con entirely, or try to convince me the others were fake while she was real. She chose option 3. Sarah, honey, listen to me, she said, reaching across the table to grab my hand with clammy fingers. I don't know who these other people are or how they got information about you, but I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I held you when you were born. The connection between us is real, can't you feel it? It was a masterful manipulation attempt, appealing to every adoptee's desperate hunger for biological connection. 3 months ago, it might have worked. But Margaret Hendricks had already confessed to selling my file to David Chen's reunification scam operation, and I knew exactly how Linda had acquired her maternal instincts. The connection I feel, I said slowly, is wondering how much David Chen paid you for this performance. Linda's hand jerked away from mine like she'd been burned. I don't know what you're talking about. David Chen. Phoenix Warehouse. Family Reunification Services. I recited the details Detective Reyes had shared. 43 foster kids targeted across 4 states. Ring any bells? She stood up so abruptly her chair scraped against the floor, drawing stares from other customers. I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding. I should go. Sit down, Linda. Something in my tone made her freeze halfway to standing. Maybe it was the complete absence of the vulnerable, desperate for family voice I'd been using for weeks. Or maybe it was the way I'd said her real name with absolute certainty. My name is Sarah Chan, I continued as she slowly sank back into her chair. I'm 22 years old, I inherited $2.3 million from my adoptive grandmother, and yesterday the FBI arrested David Chen and 12 other people involved in a foster care inheritance scam. Today they're picking up the remaining targets. Linda's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, like a fish drowning in air. The question is whether you want to cooperate now, or wait for them to show up at your apartment with handcuffs. Because either way, this conversation is being recorded, and Detective Angela Reyes is sitting 3 tables behind you taking notes. Linda didn't turn around to look, but her shoulders slumped in complete defeat. How long have you known? She whispered. Since the first day you mispronounced my name. Linda's confession came in fragments over the next 20 minutes, interrupted by sobbing and desperate attempts to justify what she'd done. The FBI had indeed approached her 3 weeks ago, not to arrest her, but to offer her a deal. Cooperate in exposing the remaining scammers, and they'd reduce her charges from federal fraud to simple theft. They wanted me to wear a wire, she said, mascara streaking down her cheeks in genuine rivers this time. To get Thomas and Janet and Robert on tape admitting to the scam. But when I saw how much you wanted to believe. She trailed off, staring at her hands. You decided to go rogue, I finished. To actually try and con me for real. She nodded miserably. The FBI was only offering immunity. You were offering a real payday. Thomas bragged that marks like you, desperate adoptees with new money, were usually good for at least $50,000 before they got suspicious. The casual cruelty of that phrase, asterisk marks like you asterisk, hit harder than I expected. I'd known intellectually that I was being targeted for my vulnerabilities, but hearing it reduced to such clinical terms made something cold and furious settle in my chest. How much were you hoping to get from me? I asked. Initially? David Chen said to ask for $20,000. Family reunion costs, he called it. Money for a nice apartment where we could spend time together, maybe a car so I could visit regularly. Linda laughed bitterly. But when I met you, when I saw that apartment and realized how lonely you were, I started thinking bigger. Detective Reyes had moved closer during Linda's breakdown, close enough to catch every word. She gave me a subtle nod, they had everything they needed. The others don't know the FBI flipped you, I said. It wasn't a question. Thomas thinks I'm just another freelancer working the same mark. Janet and Robert have no idea I exist. This was supposed to be a solo job until David Chen got greedy and started selling your information to multiple buyers. Which means they're still planning to escalate their own cons. Linda's eyes widened as she realized what I was getting at. Sarah, you can't be thinking of going after them directly. Thomas isn't like me, he's dangerous. Last year in Nevada, when a mark figured out his game, Thomas didn't just walk away. The guy ended up hospitalized. But I was already thinking 3 steps ahead. The FBI had Linda's cooperation, but they needed evidence of active fraud attempts from the other 3. With Linda's inside knowledge of their methods and Detective Reyes' surveillance capabilities, I could give them exactly what they needed. Here's what's going to happen, I told Linda, pulling out my phone. You're going to call Thomas, Janet, and Robert. Tell them I'm ready to make this official, that I want to set up trust funds for my newly discovered family members. Tomorrow night, 7 p.m., at my apartment. They'll never all agree to meet together, Linda protested. Thomas specifically said to keep this compartmentalized. Then we make it irresistible, I said, scrolling to my banking app and taking a screenshot of my account balance. Tell them I'm writing checks tomorrow night, but I want to meet everyone at once because the emotional reunion is too overwhelming to repeat multiple times. Detective Reyes appeared at our table before Linda could respond, her badge discreetly visible in her palm. Linda Kowalski, we need to continue this conversation downtown, she said calmly. Sarah, I'll call you tonight with details about tomorrow's operation. As they walked toward the exit, Linda turned back one last time. For what it's worth, she said, I really did start to care about you. That part wasn't fake. But it was too late for her regret to matter. The call from Detective Reyes came at 11:47 p.m., just as I was falling asleep on Helen's old couch with case files scattered across my chest. "We have a problem," she said without preamble. "Thomas Petrov didn't just disappear after Linda's arrest this afternoon. He cleaned out his motel room and ditched the stolen BMW. But here's the kicker. He withdrew $3,200 from an ATM in Barstow 2 hours ago using a credit card registered to someone named Marcus Webb." I sat up, instantly awake. Another identity? His fourth one that we know of. Sarah, this man has been running inheritance scams for over 20 years. He's not going to just walk away from a $2.3 million target because his competition got arrested. My blood ran cold. You think he's escalating? I think he's desperate. Linda's arrest means his window is closing fast. He knows we're onto the whole operation. Desperate people do unpredictable things. I walked to my front window and peered through the blinds at the parking lot below. Every shadow suddenly looked like it could be hiding someone. What about Janet and Robert? Janet Williams panicked and drove to Las Vegas this morning. We tracked her to a casino hotel, probably trying to disappear into the crowds. Robert Martinez is still local, but he's not answering his phone, and his landlord says he hasn't been home in 2 days. So much for my plan to trap all 4 fraudsters in one coordinated operation. Now they were scattered, paranoid, and potentially dangerous. "Detective Reyes," I said slowly, "what exactly did Linda tell them about me before she was arrested?" The pause on the other end of the line lasted too long. "Linda's debriefing revealed some complications," Detective Reyes finally said. "She may have embellished certain details about your emotional state and financial accessibility when she was coordinating with the others." "What kind of embellishments?" "She told Thomas you were severely depressed about Helen's death and desperately seeking family connection. She also mentioned that you keep large amounts of cash in your apartment because you don't trust banks after growing up in foster care. Neither of those things was true, but I could see how they'd make me an irresistible target for someone like Thomas. A grieving, emotionally vulnerable young woman with poor financial security sitting alone with a fortune. It was a predator's dream scenario." "How large amounts are we talking about?" I asked. "Linda claimed you showed her $50,000 in cash that you keep in Helen's old jewelry box for emergencies." My stomach dropped. That jewelry box was real. Helen had kept her wedding ring and a few precious family pieces in an antique wooden box on her bedroom dresser. I'd mentioned it to Linda during one of her visits, talking about how I couldn't bear to move Helen's personal items yet. But I'd never said anything about money. So now Thomas thinks I'm an easy mark with $50,000 in cash just sitting in my apartment. "Sarah, I need you to pack a bag and stay somewhere else tonight. We're working on tracking Thomas down, but until we locate him." "No." The word came out harder than I'd intended. "I'm not running away from this. If Thomas wants to escalate, let him come. But this time, we'll be ready." "Absolutely not. This isn't a game anymore. Thomas Petrov has a history of violence, and you're not trained for." "Then train me," I interrupted. "You've got, 12 hours until he makes his move. Use them." Detective Reyes sighed heavily. "Sarah, I understand the impulse for justice here, but this isn't about justice anymore," I said, surprising myself with the honesty. "It's about control. These people have been manipulating me for weeks, exploiting the worst trauma of my childhood, making me dance to their agenda. I want Thomas Petrov to walk into a trap of my making." The line went quiet for almost a minute. "If we do this," Detective Reyes finally said, "it's a federal operation with FBI oversight. You follow orders exactly, no improvisation, no hero moves. And if I say abort, we abort immediately." "Agreed. Pack that bag anyway. Whether Thomas shows up tomorrow or not, after this is over, you're going into protective custody until we locate the others." But as I hung up and started throwing clothes into Helen's old suitcase, I couldn't shake the feeling that by tomorrow night, everything would be different. One way or another, this was going to end. The surveillance equipment arrived at 6 a.m. sharp, delivered by 2 FBI technicians who transformed my apartment into something from a spy movie within 3 hours. Micro cameras disguised as picture frames, audio receivers hidden inside lamp bases, and a panic button designed to look like Helen's old reading glasses case. "Remember, Agent Martinez, Detective Reyes' FBI contact, said as he tested the final camera angle, your job is to get Thomas talking about the scam on record. Let him think he's in control of the conversation." "And if he gets violent?" I asked, fingering the panic button. "We'll have 4 agents positioned in the hallway, 2 more in the apartment across from you, and Detective Reyes monitoring everything from the surveillance van downstairs. He won't get within 3 feet of you before we intervene." Agent Martinez handed me a small earpiece, nearly invisible once inserted. "Detective Reyes will be coaching you through this entire conversation. Follow her lead, don't improvise, and remember, we need him to explicitly admit to fraud and conspiracy charges." By 5:30 p.m., everyone was in position. I sat in Helen's old armchair, wearing the same vulnerable expression I'd perfected over weeks of dealing with fraudsters, while FBI agents crouched in my hallway like deadly shadows. My phone buzzed at 6:47 p.m. with a text from an unknown number. "Sarah, this is Thomas. I'm downstairs. We need to discuss your family situation urgently." I hadn't given Thomas my address during any of our previous meetings. The fact that he'd found it meant he'd been watching me, learning my routines, planning something more elaborate than a simple con. "Let him up," Detective Reyes whispered through my earpiece. "Act surprised but pleased to hear from him." I buzzed him into the building and opened my apartment door, leaving it slightly ajar while I positioned myself near the kitchen, exactly where Agent Martinez had instructed me to stand for optimal camera coverage. When Thomas knocked, I called out, "It's open," in what I hoped sounded like naive trust rather than tactical positioning. He entered slowly, and immediately I noticed differences from our previous encounters. Gone was the expensive suit and confident demeanor. Thomas looked haggard, unshaven, wearing jeans and a wrinkled shirt that suggested he'd been sleeping in his car. His eyes darted around my apartment, cataloging exits and searching for something specific. "Sarah, thank God you're safe," he said, but his tone carried an edge that made my skin crawl. "I heard about what happened to Linda. These other people claiming to be your family, they're dangerous." "Dangerous how?" I asked, letting confusion color my voice. Thomas moved deeper into my apartment, his gaze lingering on Helen's bedroom doorway. They're part of an organized scam targeting inheritance cases. Linda Kowalski isn't even her real name. She's been arrested for fraud in 3 states. The irony of Thomas Petrov, currently using the Marcus Webb identity, warning me about people using fake names almost made me laugh. But Detective Rhea's voice in my ear kept me focused. Keep him talking about the scam operation. We need details. How do you know all this? I asked. Because I've been investigating them, Thomas said smoothly, pulling out what looked like a private investigator's license. Your real grandfather hired me weeks ago to track down these fraudsters and protect you from their schemes. My real grandfather. Thomas was doubling down on his original lie while simultaneously positioning himself as my protector. It was almost admirable in its audacity. Ask him about the others, Detective Reyes whispered. Janet and Robert. What about the other 2 people who contacted me? Janet Williams and Robert Martinez? Thomas's expression hardened. Part of the same ring. They've been selling false hope to adoptees across the country, taking advantage of people's deepest vulnerabilities. He paused, studying my face intently. But you already suspected that, didn't you, Sarah? Something in his tone made every nerve in my body scream danger. I suspected something was off, I admitted carefully, watching Thomas move closer to Helen's bedroom door. But I wasn't sure what. Smart girl, he said, and something about the way he said it made my stomach clench. That's why I need to get you somewhere safe tonight. My contacts at the FBI say there might be more of them coming. Through my earpiece, Detective Reyes' voice was sharp. He's lying about FBI contacts. Keep him focused on the bedroom. We think that's what he's really after. Actually, I said, trying to sound grateful but confused, I feel pretty safe here. This building has good security, and I've been keeping Helen's important documents locked up just in case. Thomas's head snapped toward me with laser focus. Documents? Financial papers, insurance policies, that sort of thing, I said, letting my voice drop as if sharing a secret. Helen was old-fashioned about banks. She kept a lot of cash around for emergencies, and I haven't figured out what to do with it yet. The transformation in Thomas's demeanor was immediate and terrifying. The concerned grandfather act evaporated, replaced by something predatory and calculating. He stepped between me and the front door, casually, as if it were accidental, but I caught the deliberate positioning. How much cash are we talking about, Sarah? Maybe 50,000? It's in her old jewelry box in the bedroom. I know I should deposit it, but... I shrugged helplessly. It feels like letting go of her, you know? Thomas nodded sympathetically, but his eyes had gone cold. It's not safe to keep that much money here, especially with these scammers knowing where you live. Why don't you show me where it is? I can help you secure it properly. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but Agent Martinez had been clear. I needed to get Thomas into the bedroom where the primary cameras were positioned, and I needed him to explicitly reveal his criminal intent. I suppose that makes sense, I said, moving toward Helen's room. It's just hard to trust anyone right now, with all these fake family members showing up. Trust is earned, Thomas said, following close behind me. Too close. But I'm here to protect you, Sarah. That's what family does. I opened Helen's bedroom door and pointed to the antique jewelry box on the dresser. It's in there, underneath her wedding ring and some old photographs. Thomas moved past me toward the dresser, and for a moment his back was turned. That's when I saw Detective Reyes through the bedroom window, positioned in the building across the street with a rifle scope trained on my apartment. The sight should have been reassuring, but Thomas was now between me and the only exit. This is beautiful craftsmanship, Thomas said, running his fingers over the jewelry box. Helen had excellent taste. He opened it carefully, and I watched his expression change as he found exactly what he expected, bundles of cash that the FBI had planted as props, along with Helen's real jewelry and some family photographs. 50,000, just like you said. Thomas's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper. You know, Sarah, I think we need to discuss your situation more honestly. What do you mean? Thomas closed the jewelry box and turned to face me, and I saw something in his expression that made my blood turn to ice. I mean the part where you've been playing games with me for weeks. Through my earpiece, Detective Reyes hissed, abort. Now. Get out of that room. But Thomas was already moving toward the bedroom door, his hand reaching into his jacket pocket. The part where you think you're smarter than people who've been running cons since before you were born. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized Thomas had been playing a deeper game than any of us understood. And now I was trapped. Thomas pulled what looked like a small recording device from his jacket pocket, not a weapon, and my momentarily frozen terror shifted into confusion. You see, Sarah, he said, setting the device on Helen's dresser next to the jewelry box, I've been recording our conversations too. Every single one, starting with that first meeting where you pretended to be so grateful for your long-lost grandfather. My mouth went dry. Through my earpiece, Detective Reyes was barking orders to the tactical team, but her voice sounded distant against the roaring in my ears. The thing about running inheritance scams for 2 decades, Thomas continued conversationally, is you develop a sense for when marks are playing back. Your performance has been flawless, I'll give you that. But you made one critical mistake. What mistake? The words came out as barely a whisper. Linda Kowalski called me yesterday morning, 3 hours before the FBI picked her up. Told me everything, how you'd been recording conversations, how you knew details about David Chen's operation that no genuine mark should know, how you were setting up some kind of trap. Thomas smiled, and it was the most terrifying expression I'd ever seen. She was hoping to cut a deal, you see. Thought if she gave me enough warning about your little scheme, I might split whatever I managed to get from you. The bedroom felt like it was shrinking around us. So you knew. This whole time, you knew I was working with the police. I suspected after Linda's call. But I wasn't certain until tonight, when you led me straight to exactly the amount of cash Linda claimed you'd shown her, sitting in exactly the location she described. Thomas picked up one of the prop money bundles, fanning through obviously fake bills. $50,000 in FBI training currency. Very professional setup. Through the window, I could see Detective Reyes frantically coordinating with her team. But Thomas was right, they positioned themselves to catch a desperate con artist, not someone who'd been 3 steps ahead from the beginning. Here's what's going to happen, Thomas said, his voice taking on that same grandfatherly tone he'd used during our first meeting. You're going to call your bank's after-hours line and arrange a wire transfer. $200,000 to an account I'll provide. Consider it payment for the entertainment value of watching you think you were outsmarting me. The FBI will never let that transfer go through, I said, surprised by how steady my own voice sounded. The FBI agents positioned in your hallway? The ones monitoring from apartment 4B across the hall? Or maybe you mean Detective Reyes in the surveillance van? Thomas chuckled. Sarah, I've been watching this building for 6 hours. I know exactly where everyone is positioned, and I know exactly how long it takes building security to respond to emergencies. He moved to Helen's bedroom window and pulled the curtains closed, cutting off Detective Reyes' line of sight. The beautiful thing about federal operations, Thomas continued, is how predictable they are. Protocols, procedures, chain of command. It takes the average FBI tactical team 4 to 7 minutes to adapt when their primary plan falls apart. My earpiece crackled with static, then went silent. Thomas held up a small electronic device that looked like a garage door opener. Signal jammer. Nothing fancy, but it'll buy us the time we need. He sat down on Helen's bed, casual as if we were old friends catching up. Now, about that wire transfer. I'd suggest we move quickly. Your federal friends are probably getting very nervous right about now. I stared at him, and for the first time in weeks, I was completely out of my depth. Every trap I'd set, every clever manipulation I'd planned, every advantage I thought I held, Thomas had anticipated all of it. You're not really my grandfather, I said stupidly. No, Sarah, I'm not. But unlike the others, I never needed to be. I just needed you to believe you were hunting me while I was actually hunting you. The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours but was probably only seconds. Thomas sat on Helen's bed like he owned the place, watching me with the patience of a predator who knew his prey had nowhere to run. You want to know the really beautiful part of this whole operation? He said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through what looked like banking information. David Chen's Phoenix warehouse was never the top of this food chain. That was just the retail level, small-time players running penny ante cons on desperate adoptees. My legs felt unsteady, and I gripped the edge of Helen's dresser for support. What are you talking about? I'm talking about a $20 million operation spanning 12 states and 47 inheritance cases over the past 3 years, Thomas said, his voice carrying the pride of someone describing a masterpiece. David Chen was buying stolen case files for $500 and selling them to street-level scammers for $2,000. But the real money comes from marks like you, recent inheritors with emotional vulnerabilities and poor security protocols. He stood up and walked to the closed bedroom door, pressing his ear against it for a moment before returning to his position blocking my exit. The FBI thinks they shut down the whole network when they arrested Chen and his 12 associates. What they don't realize is that they barely touched the surface. Chen was a contractor, not the architect. Through the jam static in my earpiece, I thought I could hear muffled shouting from the hallway. The tactical team was probably trying to figure out why their communications had gone dark. So what are you? I asked, trying to keep him talking while desperately searching for any possible escape route. The architect? Thomas laughed, a sound that made my skin crawl. I'm middle management. The architects are people whose names you'll never know, who've been running family reunification scams since before the internet made identity theft easy. This whole operation exists because there are thousands of adoptees and foster kids who come into money every year, and most of them would give anything to find their biological families. He pulled a different phone from his other pocket, a burner device that looked like something from a spy movie. The beauty of emotional manipulation, Thomas continued, is that marks like you do most of the work for us. You research your own case histories trying to find clues about your origins. You make your financial situations public through inheritance announcements. You practically gift wrap your vulnerabilities and hand them to anyone smart enough to exploit them. The casual cruelty in his voice reminded me of Linda's confession about marks like you, but Thomas made her seem amateur by comparison. This wasn't just about money for him, it was about the psychological satisfaction of exploiting people's deepest wounds. 200,000, I said slowly, that's not retirement money for someone running a $20 million operation. What do you really want? Thomas's expression shifted, and for the first time since he'd revealed his true nature, he looked genuinely pleased. Now you're asking the right questions. You're right, 200,000 is pocket change. What I want is something much more valuable. He held up his original recording device, the one he'd placed on Helen's dresser when this nightmare began. I want 6 hours of high-quality audio of you describing exactly how the FBI runs inheritance fraud investigations. Their protocols, their surveillance methods, their coordination with local police departments. Everything you learned working with Detective Angela Reyes. My stomach dropped as I realized the scope of what he was asking for. You want me to help you destroy future investigations? I want you to help me make this operation bulletproof, Thomas corrected. Every technique they used against David Chen's network, every weakness they exploited, every procedural advantage they relied on. With that information, we can restructure the entire system to be completely invisible to federal detection. Outside, I could hear what sounded like heavy footsteps in the hallway, but Thomas seemed completely unconcerned. And if I refuse? I asked. Thomas smiled that terrifying smile again and picked up the jewelry box containing Helen's Real wedding ring alongside the FBI's prop money. Then we moved to Plan B, which involves a very tragic break-in where a young inheritance recipient was murdered by desperate criminals who'd been stalking her for weeks. The footsteps in the hallway were getting closer. The sound of splintering wood exploded through the apartment as the FBI tactical team breached my front door. Thomas spun toward the bedroom door, his calm facade finally cracking, but he was already too late. This is Agent Martinez, FBI. Thomas Petrov, you're surrounded. Through the chaos of shouting voices and heavy boots, I heard Detective Reyes barking orders, bedroom, northeast corner. Suspect is armed and has compromised communications. Thomas grabbed my wrist, his fingers digging in hard enough to leave bruises. You little bitch, he hissed, all pretense of grandfatherly concern evaporated. You planned this. Actually, I said, surprised by how calm my own voice sounded, you planned this. I just let you. His eyes narrowed in confusion just as the bedroom door exploded inward. 4 FBI agents in tactical gear flooded the room, weapons trained on Thomas, who still had his hand wrapped around my wrist like a human shield. Release the civilian and step back. Agent Martinez commanded. But I wasn't done with Thomas Petrov yet. The signal jammer, I said loudly enough for everyone to hear, is in his left jacket pocket. The recording device on the dresser has been running for the past 27 minutes. And the phone in his right hand contains the contact information for the real architects of this $20 million inheritance fraud operation. Thomas's grip on my wrist loosened as he stared at me in shock. How did you? You made one critical mistake, I said, echoing his earlier words back to him. You assumed I was the same desperate, vulnerable mark you've been exploiting for weeks. But the thing about growing up in foster care is you learn to survive people who are smarter, stronger, and more ruthless than you are. Detective Reyes appeared behind the tactical team, her weapon drawn but her expression focused entirely on me. Sarah, are you hurt? I'm fine, I said, pulling free from Thomas's now limp grasp. But you're going to want to hear that recording. Thomas just confessed to running a multi-state inheritance fraud operation targeting adoptees and foster children. He also threatened to murder me if I didn't cooperate with destroying federal investigations. Agent Martinez moved forward with handcuffs while two other agents secured Thomas's devices. Thomas Petrov, also known as Marcus Webb, also known as David Richardson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, extortion, and terrorist threats. As they read him his rights, Thomas looked at me with something between fury and grudging respect. This isn't over, he said. The people I work for will be joining you in federal prison, Detective Reyes interrupted, holding up her own recording device. Because while your signal jammer blocked the earpiece communication, it didn't touch the backup audio surveillance we installed in your motel room 3 days ago. We've been listening to your phone calls with your architects all week. The color drained from Thomas's face completely. That's impossible. I checked for bugs. You checked for standard FBI surveillance, Agent Martinez said as his team led Thomas toward the door. You didn't check for the equipment the NSA lends us for cases involving organized interstate crime rings. As the tactical team cleared out of my apartment, I sank into Helen's old armchair and finally allowed myself to shake. Detective Reyes sat across from me, holstering her weapon and pulling out a notepad. 47 inheritance cases, she said quietly. 12 states. $20 million stolen from people who'd already survived abandonment, abuse, and foster care. Sarah, what you did tonight just brought down the largest family reunification fraud operation in federal history. I stared at the jewelry box still sitting on Helen's dresser, containing her wedding ring and a lifetime of precious memories alongside FBI prop money. What happens to the other victims? Full restitution where possible, counseling services, and a victims' compensation fund that should help everyone rebuild, Detective Reyes said. The federal prosecutors estimate we'll recover about $14 million in assets from the criminal network. 6 months later, I was back in that same chair when the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. Robert Martinez and Janet Williams had both been arrested in Las Vegas, and the federal trial had resulted in convictions for all 43 defendants involved in the inheritance fraud ring. The $2.3 million Helen left me remained untouched in a secure trust fund, but I'd found a better use for the $847,000 in victim compensation money the courts awarded me. The Helen Chin Foundation for Foster Care Protection now employed 12 investigators nationwide, working exclusively to protect vulnerable adoptees from inheritance fraud. Margaret Hendricks received 5 years in federal prison and the permanent loss of her social work license. Her son Danny completed rehab successfully and sent me a letter of apology that I kept in Helen's jewelry box alongside her wedding ring. Linda Kowalski served 18 months and was released last week. She sent me a postcard from Portland where she's working as a grocery store cashier, starting over at 53 with a clean slate and what she claimed was genuine remorse. Thomas Petrov received 25 years without parole. The architects he worked for, 3 people who'd been running inheritance scams since the 1990s, got life sentences. But the real victory came in smaller moments, when the Henderson twins in Sacramento were able to recover $45,000 stolen through a fake family reunion scam, when Marcus Chin in Detroit, no relation, despite the shared name, successfully prosecuted the people who'd exploited his adoption trauma, when dozens of other foster kids learned to protect themselves from predators who saw their pain as profit opportunities. I never did find my biological parents. But sitting in Helen's chair, surrounded by case files of people I'd helped protect, I realized I'd found something better, a family of choice that couldn't be faked, bought, or stolen by anyone desperate enough to try. The knock on my door these days comes from social workers referring new cases, FBI agents coordinating investigations, and occasionally, grateful families whose children I've helped protect from the Thomas Petrovs of the world. And when someone claims to be my long-lost relative now, I just smile and tell them they're welcome to prove it, through legitimate DNA testing, verified legal documentation, and a background check that would make the FBI proud. After all, real family doesn't show up because you inherited money. Real family shows up because they never left.